Greetings everyone, Shalom. In this video we'll be doing a deep dive into the term or the title Nazoraean or Nazōraios in the Greek, and why I believe that this term Nazoraean is essentially a combination of the terms Nazara and Ossaeans. So I'll explain why I believe the term or the title Nazoraean is a combination of the words Nazara and Ossaean, and it literally means the Ossaeans from Nazareth, the Essenes from Nazareth. So the Nazoraeans were essentially a subsect of Essenes or Ossaeans that came from the region of Nazareth, which I believe included the Transjordan area, parts of modern-day Jordan and Syria, all the way up as far north as Damascus, northern Israel, and Galilee. So all of that was included in this region that was known in ancient times as Nazareth. And so that's the derivation of the term Nazoraean. It's a combination of Nazareth and Ossaean, and it literally means the Essenes from Nazareth. Okay? Nazoraeos is a sectarian title, not a geographic one. Okay? So in the New Testament, there are two words used for Nazarene, all right? But Nazōraios is used more often, more than twice as much, and it denotes a sectarian title. So it was a group and not a place. So in other words, it was not Jesus of Nazareth, it was Jesus the Nazarene, or Jesus the Nazoraean. Okay? So Nazōraios is a sectarian title. All right? So for example, in Matthew, it says, "He shall be called Nazōraios, as a fulfillment of prophecy, yet no such prophecy exists." In the Tanakh, in the Old Testament. This alone hints that Nazōraios was not originally toponymic, meaning from a town. So it's not Jesus of Nazareth, it's Jesus the Nazarene, because he belonged to a sect known as the Nazarenes or Nazoraeans. Okay? So in early Christian and Jewish Christian usage, in Acts, for example, we see the sect of the Nazoraeoi, the Nazoraeans, the Nazarenes. So it was a sect. we know this. All right? So the idea that his title was Jesus of Nazareth, Yeshua of Nazareth, is a misnomer. It's Jesus the Nazarene, or Yeshua the Nazoraean. Okay? He was from this sect known as the Nazarenes, or Nazōraios. Okay, it's a sectarian title. As a matter of fact, the town of Nazareth, there's no evidence, zero, that it even existed at the time that Yeshua was alive. It was named that after his death, okay? And probably named after him, not the other way around, right? So it's an explicit sect name. No one ever said the sect of the Bethlehemites or the sect of the Capernaumites. The pattern suggests Nazōraios referred to a religious order, not a birthplace. All right, here we see its usage in the New Testament. So this here, Nazōraios, is the sectarian title, whereas Nazarenos means of Nazareth, okay, denoting someone that is from the town of Nazareth, right? But this one, Nazōraios, was used far more often, okay? So it was obviously a sectarian title, probably Essene in origin, right? So the Ossaean connection, Epiphanius's key clue. So in the the Panarion 19, where he's discussing the Ossaeans, Epiphanius traces a lineage from the Ossaeans to the Nazoraeans to the Ebionites. So he says that the Ebionites started off as the Ossaeans. They evolved into the Nazoraeans, the Ossaeans from Nazareth, from this region, okay, a subsect of Essenes. And they eventually came to be known as the Ebionites later on. So he draws this clear lineage. And actually he says that, as a matter of fact, this group, prior to becoming known as the Ebionites, were the Elkosites. All right? And so that essentially the Essenes merged with the Elkosites and became the Ebionites, according to Epiphanius, according to his historical sources and documents. All right? So this is not a random sequence, it's a spiritual genealogy or lineage. The Nazoraeans evolved from the Ossaeans. All right? So the Ossaeans we can think of as the original group, the original Essenes. There was a subsect of the Essenes that lived in the north, okay, that lived in like parts of modern-day Syria, Jordan, around the Galilee, and that area was known as Nazareth in ancient times, and so they became known as the Ossaeans from Nazareth, the Ossaeans, Nazoraeans, right? So if the Ossaeans were a northern Judean or Galilean sect, then Nazōraioi could quite literally have meant Ossaeans from Nazareth, that is, the Galilean branch of the Ossaean movement. Epiphanius even distinguishes Nazoraeans, Jewish followers of Yeshua who kept Torah, from Nazarenes, which he said was a geographical term showing that Nazōraios and Nazareth were not synonymous in his day. Julius Africanus, in one of his letters that was preserved by Eusebius, it says, for the relatives of our Savior according to the flesh on the ground of their descent from the family of David were known by the name of Nazareans, and they came from the village of Nazareth. All right. So here, Julius Africanus confirms that Nazareth was a historical place in Judea, and that Jesus' kin were known as Nazareans. Therefore, the Nazōraioi were not simply people from a Galilean hamlet called Nazareth, but a Davidic Judean sect, perhaps identical or related to the Essenes, hence the Ossaeans from Nazareth. Okay. Now, this village of Nazareth was just a tiny hamlet, and I believe that it was probably named that based upon this lineage. Okay, Netzer means branch, the branch of David. Okay, Essene might even mean Jesseans, who came from Jesse, and all this stuff. So it can mean a lineage, a branch. Some people think that the root actually means the keepers of the law, keepers of the way, something like that. That's also possible. Okay, so some of this is speculation, of course. But at any rate, so the village of Nazareth, that was the ancient term. Okay, but actually, let's skip ahead a bit. Yeah, Pliny, the elder, in his book Natural History, mentions an area called the Tetrarchy of the Nazarene. All right? And so he describes it as being in Kole, I don't know how to pronounce that, Syria, which is an ancient Roman province. All right? And this was in the north. Okay, the geographical marker puts them far north of Galilee, where Nazareth is located, closer to the Orontes, Epimea region. so up into Syria. Okay, so that's what he called the Tetrarchy of the Nazarene, meaning ancient Nazareth. All right, so this idea that Nazareth was somehow just a tiny little town or hamlet, well, that idea came later, and it was named after, I equate it to, the modern day usage, for example, of terms like Little Italy, or even something like New York, New England. So that the town of Nazareth that was later attributed to Yeshua was probably just a sort of memory of the larger region of Nazareth, the Tetrarchy of the Nazarene, as it was called, in this census. This, by the way, was from like 30 BC, referring back to this Tetrarchy of the Nazarene. So it goes all the way back to 30 BC, okay, where he's getting this information that it was in, parts of Syria, probably the Transjordan, in the north, all right? And so actually, Nazareth, the town or the tiny little hamlet outside of Sepphoris or whatever, that could have just been sort of a vestigial memory of the larger region of Nazareth, and so they just named it that, and it sort of means something akin to, New Nazareth, New Nazareth, or Little Nazareth, Little Nazareth, something like that, right? But it's just a vestigial memory of the larger region that was known as this tribal area associated with Nazareth, the name Nazareth, okay, the Nazarene, all right? Okay. So the linguistic fusion of Nazareth and Ossaean, phonetically and morphologically, the fusion is elegant and entirely natural in Greek. Nazara, okay, and Ossaeos, when you combine the two terms, the combination is the term Nazoraeos. Fascinating, no? So here's how the blending could have occurred linguistically. In Aramaic Hebrew or Hebrew speech, the final A in Nazareth merges with the guttural onset of Ossaean, or possibly in the Aramaic or Hebrew could have been Ossaim. The result, Naz-Ossaim, Nazoraim, is the Greek transliteration. Okay, here you have it in the Greek. So Greek phonology drops the double sibilant cluster and normalizes the vowel of Ossaean, osa, ora. Thus the Greek Nazōraios perfectly preserves the vowel pattern and rhythm of a fusion between Nazara and Ossaean. This would not be unprecedented. Greek transliterations of Semitic ethnonyms often compress two terms. For example, Samarites, okay, Galileos, right? So this was not out of the ordinary, in other words. In ancient times, the Greek transliteration of the Aramaic or Hebrew names was common, and this is how it occurred. So actually, I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy here. Obviously, ChatGPT helped me out with this, but it is highly probable, actually, that the combination of the terms Nazareth, the place, with the Greek term for the Essenes, the original Greek term for the Essenes, which could have been Ossaeos, okay, the combination of those two terms is Nazōraios. It's pretty clear, all right, and this is how it all works linguistically. Of course, I'm not an expert in Aramaic or Hebrew or Greek. I've been learning Greek for about 6 months, but by no means an expert, not even close. But this all makes sense to me. And so it is highly probable that the combination of the terms Nazareth and Ossaeos, which I believe was the original name for the original group of Essenes, the original Essenes, that combination is in fact Nazōraios. which means Nazoraeans, Nazarenes. The Essenes from Nazara, the Essenes from this region in the north, the Tetrarchy of the Nazarene, okay, which was known in ancient times as Nazara, all right? And it was this region, again, where you had this mixing of Neo-Pythagoreans and these Hellenized towns with the Jewish populations in those towns. And what came out of that melting pot of Neo-Pythagorean culture and lifestyle and philosophy mixed with Jewish mysticism, what came out of that melting pot were the Ossaeans, or the Essenes. Okay, that's why the Essenes are vegetarians, they're anti-sacrifice, they wear white linen, and they're communalists, they're pacifists, they practice voluntary poverty. These are all Pythagorean ideas. There's some evidence to suggest that they possibly even believed in reincarnation, which is another Pythagorean idea. All right. I think, for example, in the Gospel of Thomas, and even in the New Testament, there's some evidence that Yeshua believed in reincarnation. Right? By the way, in a recent Pew Research poll that surveyed religious beliefs in the United States, 30% of Catholics and Protestants believe in reincarnation. In the U.S., 30%, 1/3 of Christians. The Christian population in the U.S., 30% of the Christian population in the United States of America believes in reincarnation, 1/3. So this is not a fringe idea in modern Christianity, nor was it a fringe idea in ancient times. As we know, in some of these councils that met in ancient times, they eradicated the belief in reincarnation, which was fairly common at that time for Christians, right? So, the geographic plausibility, the Ossaeans were northern. Several early clues place the Ossaeans, or proto-Essenes, north of Jerusalem. Epiphanius says the Ossaeans and Nazarenes predate Christ, possibly emerging from the same northern pious movement that gave rise to the Therapeuti in Egypt and the Nazareans in Galilee. This group, the Therapeuti, by the way, was in Egypt. Philo wrote about them. They were just another sect of Essenes, very very similar. They were more Pythagorean than the groups in Judea and Israel and all that. Okay, but they were Essenes. The Panarion explicitly connects Ossaeans and Nazoraeans in sequence, implying territorial and doctrinal continuity. So when Yeshua is called the Nazōraios, it could mean the one belonging to the northern Ossaeans, the Nazara branch. That fits precisely with his Galilean setting, ascetic ethos, and his disciples' resemblance to Essenes in lifestyle. Okay? Clearly, Yeshua was an Essene, right? He was vegetarian, he was pacifist, he was communalist, voluntary poverty, sort of an ascetic lifestyle. He went off by himself to pray all the time for long periods and all that, fasting, and these are all Essene practices. The ritual baptismal purification in the living waters, ritual immersion in the living waters. That all this comes from the Essenes. He was an Essene. All right, and he was part of this northern branch of Essenes that I believe had one of their headquarters around Mount Arbel, and I'll explain that later in detail in this presentation. Okay, Mount Arbel was very close to the Sea of Galilee, just a couple kilometers away, and it was also very close to the hamlet of Nazareth and Sepphoris, just a few kilometers. Okay, it all fits. I'll explain everything. So again, Pliny mentioned this tetrarchy of the Nazarene from this information that he had from 30 BC. Again, an ancient Roman province known as Nazara, and it was in the north, probably Transjordan, parts of modern-day Syria, around Damascus, I believe included Galilee, northern Israel, and all that. Okay? So the Ossaeans were described as avoiding animal sacrifice, pursuing purity in all things, keeping the law, keeping the Torah. Of course, the teachings of Yeshua and the Nazoraeans, it all fits, right? It's all the same tenets and practices and beliefs. So it's the same theology evolved through revelation. Thus, Nazōraios identifies not merely a person from a village, but a purified branch of the Ossaean tradition centered around Nazareth, a spiritual enclave of the northern ascetics, or mystics, okay? The Essenes. Prophetic fulfillment and etymological memory. When Matthew says he shall be called Nazōraios, he is likely preserving an ancient sectarian epithet misunderstood later as a town name. The prophecy then was not he will be from Nazareth, but he will belong to the Nazoraeoi, the pure separated Ossaeans from Nazareth, keepers of the true way. So again, we're not entirely sure. Nazareth, the region was named after the people there, and so it could have meant the branch of David. Okay, but it also could have meant keepers of the way, the root, Netzer or Nasser, just depending on which vowels you stick in, the Hebrew consonants and everything. It could either mean the branch, or it could mean the keepers of the law, keepers of the way. We're not sure. In other words, Jesus was not of Nazareth, but of the Nazarene-Essenes, Nazoraeans, a prophetic brotherhood of purity, asceticism, and devotion to the Spirit. Okay? So, the Ossaeans existed before Christ. Epiphanius tells us as much. He also says that the Nazarenes pre-existed Christ. They were ascetic, pure, anti-sacrificial, Torah-keeping mystics. A northern group of them settled around Nazareth, a Galilean enclave. Yeshua emerged from this milieu, the Ossaeans of Nazareth, the Nazarene-Essenes, Nazoraeans. Greek writers compressed their name, okay, Nazareth and Ossaean, to create Nazōraios. We already went through that. Later editors, unaware of the sectarian nuance, retrofitted Nazareth as a birthplace, Nazareth. Okay, but the memory survived in Acts, the sect of the Nazoraeans. Paul was even called a leader of the sect of the Nazoraeoi, of the Nazoraeans, right? Even though he was really anything but. He created his own sect, didn't he? He was a cult leader, and he created his own cult based upon his own theology and his own alleged visions and divine revelation and all of that he claimed to receive from Yeshua. Of course, as y'all know, if you follow this channel, I think Paul was full of it. So, to conclude, Nazōraios means the Ossaeans of Nazareth. Okay, the Nazoraeans. Far from being a mere toponym, Nazōraios encoded an entire religious lineage. It is a sect name, not a postal address. Okay, even though the region, Nazareth, was a geographical region, okay, but it was called that because of the people that lived there, the sect that lived there, right? It tells us that Yeshua belonged to a northern Ossaean, Essene community, preserving the ideals of the pure law, vegetarian holiness, and spiritual sacrifice. Thus, the Nazoraeans were none other than the Ossaeans of Nazareth, a Galilean order of purity that became the seedbed of the early Jesus movement. Okay, so he was part of this sect. He, in other words, he inherited a tradition. He wasn't necessarily inventing anything new, although of course he changed some things and took it to a whole nother level, obviously. Okay, that's why he's considered the Messiah, right? Christos, Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one of God, the chosen of God. God's true prophet, as he's called in the Clementine literature, recognitions and homilies, the true prophet, the true Messiah, the true messenger of God, the anointed one. All right, so obviously he took this Nazarene tradition to another level, and he reformed some things, and was trying to really restore everything back to its back to the original way, the way, right? All right. So now we'll get into why I believe that the Nazōraios had one of their headquarters in Mount Arbel, in the cave complex at Mount Arbel. Okay, near the Sea of Galilee, overlooking the Sea of Galilee, as a matter of fact. And of course, that's where Yeshua's ministry was centered, in Capernaum and around the Sea of Galilee. That's where it all started, so probably he was from there. I mean, it makes sense that he already knew people there. He was already part of a social network there. He didn't just appear out of nowhere. He was part of a social, cultural heritage that existed in that area already. All right, so again, he inherited this tradition of the northern Ossaeans or northern Essenes. All right. So all of this research is based on the research of John Ben Daniel. You can go to his academia.edu page and read all of his research papers. They're fantastic. He's an amazing researcher. Highly recommend reading his stuff. So I'm greatly indebted to John Ben Daniel. I've corresponded with him a little bit. And anyway, does really, really great research on Mount Arbel and the Essenes there. So here we see the Arbel Cave Village, right? Very close to the Sea of Galilee over here, very close to Magdala, where Mary was from, and all that. So, and Capernaum and everything, but it's also very close to modern day Nazareth, okay, and Sepphoris, and the area where most scholars think Yeshua came from, although I think he was probably raised around the Arbel Cave Village. The primary sources of information on the late Second Temple Jewish religious group called the Essenes are Josephus, okay, and Philo, and Pliny, and the sectarian documents of the Dead Sea Scrolls, especially the Damascus document, the community rule, the war scroll. Due to some discrepancies between the accounts of Philo and Josephus on the one hand, and the Dead Sea Scrolls on the other, scholars have continued to doubt and debate the Qumran-Essene hypothesis. Most modern scholarship, the most recent stuff, especially over the last 10 years or so, really questions whether the Essenes lived in Qumran, wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think they did. But, well, I think the original Ossaeans, the original Essenes, founded Qumran back like maybe 200 BC and lived there for a long time and controlled the Qumran settlement and for most of its occupation and habitation. However, I think around 50 BC or so, there was a breakaway sect and a takeover by some radical leadership there, and things changed. You can see this clearly in the later Dead Sea Scrolls, the later sectarian literature like the Temple Scroll and War Scroll. Something changed. All right, but I think Qumran was originally founded by the original Ossaeans, Essenes, and that they occupied Qumran for 150 years or so until that breakaway sect takeover. I'm not alone in this, by the way. Many Dead Sea Scroll scholars and Essene scholars have posited as much, right? And they're far more educated on the matter than I am, so I trust their conclusions and assessments, all right? But well, if you look at the community scroll is very similar to, there aren't very many discrepancies between the community rule, and the group described by Philo and Josephus. As a matter of fact, you can go to ChatGPT right now and type in the prompt, which Dead Sea Scroll best aligns with the group described by Philo and Josephus, and it's the community rule by far. So, and it's the oldest scroll. It's the oldest sectarian literature found in Qumran. So it makes sense that the original Essenes or Ossaeans were responsible for the composition of the community rule, especially the community rule found in cave, cave 4 or cave 6? I don't remember, but there's an earlier variant that's even more aligned with Philo and Josephus's writings about the Essenes. At any rate, the community rule, I believe, was an original, very early Essene document. But yeah, when you look at some of the later ones, like the War Scroll and Temple Scroll, obviously something changed there in Qumran, right? But it was originally founded by the original Ossaeans, the original Essenes, right? At any rate, a close examination of the differences and similarities reveals that Philo and Josephus were describing a different faction within the same religious group. The existence of two separate Essene factions is confirmed by their connection with Jerusalem. The Qumran Essenes lived in the desert near the Dead Sea and excluded themselves from Jerusalem. The mainstream Essenes lived in communities in many towns and villages throughout the land of Israel. Qumran could only support 200 people. But, from the writings of Philo and Josephus, we're told there were 4,000 Essenes spread out all over. Right? So that Qumran group wasn't really representative of the whole, in other words. Okay? I've showed this slide before, but obviously, yeah, there were some differences between the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls that lived in Qumran and the Nazarene Essenes that Yeshua and John the Baptist belonged to, that Philo and Josephus describe. Okay, so yeah, there were some important differences there. The finding of an Essene settlement at Mount Arbel resolves the debate. The Essenes existed in other parts of the country, as stated by Josephus and Philo. Let us call this new insight the Arbel Essene hypothesis, a development of the Qumran Essene hypothesis, the Enochic Essene hypothesis, for example, from Boccaccini. I highly recommend Gabriele Boccaccini. He's an Italian researcher. His book Beyond the Essene Hypothesis is excellent. It's a must-read for anyone interested in all this stuff. He posits that, yeah, the Essenes were sort of an Enochian Judaic mystical sect. At any rate, so our research indicates that the Arbel Cave village was a large male-only settlement of Essenes founded around 100 BC. It accommodated 120 to 150 members and remained continuously occupied until about 250 AD. Okay, the town of Arbel was founded about 120 BC and was also settled by an Essene community from an early date. These members were probably married and were dedicated to agriculture. Okay, so the town of Arbel was just like, I don't know, a kilometer and a half away from the cave complex. So they lived together, the married part of the community, the householders, in other words, and along with the monks, the monastics, the ascetics that lived in the cave complex, the male-only celibates. All right? So both lived in this area, which seems to support the idea that Yeshua came out of this group because Yeshua didn't really promote celibacy, although he was probably celibate. He was probably one of these Essene, monastic ascetic mystics that practiced celibacy. We don't know. But at any rate, he didn't really promote celibacy. So obviously he was okay with people getting married and having families and all that. And so it makes sense that he came from that branch of the Ossaeans or Essenes. The Qumran branch was a little stricter with celibacy and was mostly male and all that. Right? These members were probably married and were dedicated to agriculture. They were growing flaxseed to make their linen garments out of. All right. So many of the graves in the cemetery face north and are of the cyst type. The orientation was adopted by the Essenes because of their belief in the afterlife. The Essene belief in eternal rewards for the just and eternal chastisements for the wicked led to a lot of folks don't know, but Jews at that time, many of them, most of them, didn't believe in the afterlife. The Pharisees and Sadducees. Some of them believed in the bodily resurrection. Okay, the Pharisees. At the end, end of time. But didn't really believe in an afterlife. Isn't that interesting? But the Essenes did. Well, where'd they get that idea? From the Pythagoreans, from the Greek philosophers, right? For the wicked led to the very advantageous choice of a south-north grave orientation, because the so desired paradise was in the north, according to their cosmology. The monumental main entrance of the ancient 4th century synagogue at Arbel faces east onto a courtyard. This orientation was rare. in Essene and only 3 other ancient synagogues in all of Galilee. It may have represented the entrance of a more ancient Essene building, which faced east for liturgical reasons. Before the sun is up, they uttered no word on mundane matters, but offered to him certain prayers, as though entertaining him to rise. Okay, that's from Josephus, Jewish War. At Arbel, there is good evidence for the cultivation of flax and the production of linen in Second Temple times. As argued by Jody Magnus, she's really the world's leading expert in Qumran archaeology, the archaeology at Qumran. She's an archaeologist, and she writes a lot of good articles. This was the material used to make the clothes worn by Essenes. It would also have been needed for making ropes. The town of Arbel and the surrounding cave dwellings were established from 120 to 100 BC as a refuge from religious persecution. Arbel was founded originally by Nitai the Arbelite, vice president of the Jerusalem Sanhedrin, at precisely the time when the Pharisees were exiled from Jerusalem by the ethnarch John Hyrcanus. At that time, this part of eastern Galilee was occupied by Syro-Phoenician inhabitants, as it was not annexed by the Hasmonean kingdom until 103 BC. Around this time, the Essenes were starting to return to the land of Israel from Damascus in expectation of the Messianic judgment 490 years after the end of the exile. You can find all that in the Damascus document, those prophecies. Okay, the Damascus document refers to an apostate group of Essenes departing to join the Pharisees. A possible indication of their coexistence here, where both groups were religious refugees from the Hasmoneans. During the civil war in 38 BC, Herod and his whole army came to Mount Arbel to defend the residents from the attacks of cave-dwelling brigands. Okay, so the residents of Arbel were his allies. All right, he did not come to quell rebellious residents of Arbel as currently proposed. He would not have camped so close to the rebels, and there is no evidence of destruction in the town. The army stayed at Arbel at least 6 months, in which time his forces, by the way, this is all in Jewish War by Josephus. The army stayed at Arbel for 6 months, okay, in which time his forces subdued the Hasmonean loyalists and belligerent cave dwellers in the area. In return, the residents of Arbel supported Herod and his army with provisions. This was a turning point in the Civil War, for it opened the way for the Roman legions from Syria to travel down the Jordan Valley on their way to besiege Jerusalem and remove King Antigonus in 37 BC. I've argued, as a reward for their support during the Civil War, King Herod granted the Arbel Essenes land beyond his palace in Jerusalem to establish a community. Okay, that's why you had the Essene Gate in Jerusalem and all that. All right. So they didn't support Herod, okay, but they were pacifists, so they didn't get involved in the war. They didn't fight, period, because they were pacifists. All right, so it's not like they were supporting Herod, okay? They just weren't supporting either side. They were neutral, like Switzerland. So here we've got some images of the caves at Arbel. What is described here presents a dining room, storeroom, kitchen complex, joined under what was once the overhanging canopy of a huge cave. It had a sturdy protective wall running along its open entrance, of which segment survives that includes at least 4 massive ashlars with the drafted margins and coarse bosses that are typical of the Hasmonean period. The 4 parts of this great cave, which are still visible today, bear all the hallmarks of the communal meal kitchen complex in which the Essene community assembled for their sacred meals. Because of the Essene law prohibiting lifting or moving cooking vessels on the Sabbath, especially between buildings, it was imperative that the kitchen and dining room were under the same roof. Similar arrangement had been documented in Qumran. Okay. The antechamber or vestibule is where the members of the community changed their working clothes into their sacred garments and vice versa. Okay. And the raised platform above it at the northern end of the great hall would have been ideally positioned for liturgical readings and recitations in front of the community assembled on the lower level. A rough estimate of the floor space indicates the hall would have seated at least 100 persons. There are a bunch of mikvahs, baptismal pools that they used for ritual immersion, daily ritual immersion. This was an Essene practice. All right, so this indicates the presence of a religious community with concerns about purity, very similar to Qumran. This was an Essene settlement, an Essene community, absolutely. All right. Yeah. So a lot of mikvahs, baptismal pools, ritual baptismal purification. We know was practiced in Qumran, was practiced by all the Essenes. They believed that the living waters were literally imbued with the Holy Spirit, with Ruach, and they had the uh, ability within these living waters to purify, to repent and atone, to rectify their relationship with the divine, purify themselves in the living waters, and literally commune with the divine. They thought that the living waters, were literally imbued with the power of the Holy Spirit. Okay, this is one of their key beliefs, and that this ritual baptismal purification had replaced animal sacrifice as an atonement, as a way to repent and atone and purify, and so they were completely opposed to sacrifice of any kind. All right, so again, we're going to see some similarities to Qumran. The harsh and ascetic lifestyle imposed on the Arbel cave village residents is outwardly similar to that of the Qumranites, and the rocky surroundings are comparable. The similarity of population size and sex and the approximate dates of foundation of the two communities around 100 BC are noteworthy, although Qumran is earlier. The communal dining room, storeroom, and kitchen complex is also found at Qumran. Also, the fortified space, the profusion of water installations and mikveh is a feature of both sites, indicating a common discipline, and the absence of a synagogue at either site is significant, virtually ruling out all contemporary religious communities, except for the Essenes. As of yet, the cemetery of the cave village has not been found, but if and when it is located, the burial style and orientation will help to determine the closeness of the relationship between the Arbel community and that of Qumran. The many similarities to the Qumran scribal community identified so far raise the question as to whether the residents of the Arbel cave village were also scribes, writing and interpreting the scriptures as at Qumran. This is an important question for further research, but it may be aided by the fact that the largest natural habitat of papyrus outside the borders of Egypt was growing only 30 kilometers away. Interesting. To conclude, Epiphanius preserves a rare genealogical sequence linking the Ossaeans, Nazareans, and Ebionites. This lineage implies that the Nazōraioi were a reforming regional branch of the earlier Ossaean ascetics, pious, Torah-observant, mystical Essenes. If these Ossaeans established a community in northern Galilee, perhaps near a locality remembered as Nazareth, and I think that one of their main strongholds was at Mount Arbel, within this region that was known as Nazareth in ancient times, the title Nazōraios would naturally denote Ossaean of Nazara. Okay, and we already explained the etymology of all that. This compound ethnonym would parallel similar Greek constructions. Phonetically, the fusion of Nazara and Ossaeos yields Nazoraeos in Greek. A plausible Hellenization of an Aramaic form like Netzar, Ossaim. Such compression of Semitic roots into Greek sect names is common in antiquity. I'm not inventing anything here. Theologically, this interpretation harmonizes with the Nazoraean ideals preserved in early Jewish Christian traditions: asceticism, vegetarianism, rejection of animal sacrifice, mysticism, and fidelity to the spiritual law. Okay, and it was interesting because I was discussing this with Cameron Waters, the filmmaker responsible for Christspiracy, and Aaron Abke of the Jesus Way podcast yesterday. And they've had similar insights. And as a matter of fact, when I put in our group chat, oh yeah, I've got this weird theory. I think maybe Nazoraean is a combination of the words Nazareth and Ossaean, meaning the Ossaeans from Nazareth. Aaron was like, oh yeah, I think the same thing. I've been thinking that for a while. I mean, when some of us in our little research group receive downloads at the same time or around the same time, to me that's a sign that the Holy Spirit is trying to channel something through us. When more than one of us receives the same insight or revelation around the same time, I take that as a sign from God. Okay? And you may think that's silly, or you may think I'm embellishing or exaggerating, but I believe that, y'all. I think that Nazoraeans were Essenes from the north, and that they had mixed Jewish mysticism with Neo-Pythagorean philosophy. And that's who the Ossaeans were, Neo-Pythagorean Jewish mystics. And that Yeshua was a Neo-Pythagorean Jewish mystic. And that unique combination is what is responsible for Yeshua's teachings, his message. And I believe that he came from this group of Essenes, or Nazoraeans, around Mount Arbel, around this cave complex. It matches up perfectly with his timeline and the geography. His ministry was centered around the Sea of Galilee. We know this. Mount Arbel, as a matter of fact, I think the Sermon on the Mount, I think the mount that they're talking about was Mount Arbel. I think he delivered one of his preeminent sermons, most important sermons that's preserved in the Q in both Matthew and Luke, although Luke calls it the Sermon on the Plain, but Matthew's earlier. I think that Sermon on the Mount was given at Mount Arbel to a group of these Nazoraeans, to a group of his followers from the sect. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please share it with like-minded souls. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already done so. Lots of love. Many blessings.